So we were started in 1981 as a coalition of several citizen science organizations in response at the time from pressure from school boards to teach creationism in public schools. And it was meant to be sort of a central information center to help coordinate these different efforts. And they named it the National Center for Science Education because they were like, well, we'll deal with evolution, and then we can move on to other forms of science. And then last year, they started including climate change. So it's been about 30 years of hopeful thinking, I think, that they would be able to expand. But it turns out that evolution was so much more of an issue to try to advocate for than they even realized. So now we do include climate change science, which was why I was brought on, and my colleague Mark McCaffrey as well. And so in the teaching of evolution, in the defending of evolution in public schools, over these 30 years, my colleagues started to notice these very common elements to science denial. And what they were is they ended up calling them these pillars of science denial. So anyone who's gone to see a talk by NCSE members have probably heard this before. But basically it's these pillars that hold up science denial. So the first one is undermining the science. The middle one is claiming that the results are evil. And the third one is demanding equal time for the teaching of other ideas. So with evolution, if you want to undermine the science, what does that look like? What do you say? What do you do? Anyone have any thoughts?
Me, a monkey?
Exactly. I'm not a monkey. Anyone else?
There are gaps, and so it really, I don't know, there are other theories that work better.
There's gaps in the information, therefore other theories fit better.
A lot of it related to religion.
There's the religious component as well. I don't see it. I can't see it right here in front of me. Sorry, I heard something else?
The Piltdown hoax.
Oh, the Piltdown hoax. So pointing to specific things to try to show that the science is not real, or we've been lied to, or it's some sort of conspiracy. So what they notice is exactly what you guys said. The science is wrong. We don't have enough information, and there are these conspiracies being generated by scientific ideologues who can't sort of break out of their mode of thinking. So with climate change denial of the science, what do you think that looks like? Tobacco. Sorry, go ahead.
We don't have enough information.
We don't have enough information.
It's not really scientific.
Sorry?
It's not really truly scientific.
It's not scientific. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
That's what they're doing with fracking, too. We're just saying there's no really positive scientific proof.
The science is no good. That's what they're, yeah.
It's putting doubt.
Doubt.
Doubt and fear.
Mm-hmm.
How on earth could the eye have evolved?
Well, this is back to the evolution, right? Like, yeah, how, but what's the climate change version of that?
Well, we've had these climate changes forever.
Yes.
That's how it is.
Exactly. The climate is always changing over geologic time spans, which, working my affiliation now with the paleo department, yeah, I mean, if we go back really far in time, yeah, absolutely. But that's sort of missing the point of what's going on right now. Sure.
It was really cold this winter.
Yes. Weather versus climate. This is something that drives climate scientists absolutely bonkers. Like, they lose their mind over this issue, is that the temperature right now is it's actually like 5 degrees cooler than it was last year at this time. So therefore, climate change doesn't exist. So a fundamental misunderstanding of the science. So again, with the evolution, we had the science is wrong, we don't have enough information, there are scientific conspiracies being promoted by ideologues, and then with climate change, it's the same arguments. Science is wrong, we don't have enough information, and then there's a scientific conspiracy being pushed forward by scientists who are ideologues in some fashion. And actually, I didn't hear anyone mention that, but that's another major component, is accusing scientists of driving around their fancy cars and making lots of money or something like that off of this, which, yeah, yeah. So like it's another religion of scientists or something like that. So really very similar thinking. Sure.
There's a contradiction.
Well, this is an interesting point that actually goes, so the question was, just so I can repeat it for the videotape, but also for everybody to hear, was that there's sort of this conflicting idea of, well, people haven't been on Earth that long, and the Earth is only, what was it, 4,000? 6,000, thank you, 6,000 years, yeah, 6,000 years old. And yet, if you go back into deep time, climate change isn't a problem because we've had ice ages and warmer and so on and so forth. So these ideas actually seem to conflict with each other, and why is that? And part of the reason why, and I'm so glad you brought it up because it goes to my second point, which is the second pillar. Yeah, you're like right in here. It's great. Is that there's different folks who are interested in these different issues. And so even though the science denial is the same, it tends to be, there's some crossover, it's like the Venn diagram, but it tends to be different groups. So I'll go a little bit more into that in a minute. So the second pillar is claiming that the results are evil. And you actually mentioned this before. What does that look like for evolution if the results are evil? If you believe in evolution, what happens to you? Sorry, go ahead.
The devil made me do it.
The devil made me do it.
Planted the fossils.
Did you say God planted the fossils?
God or the devil.
Oh, the devil. Somebody planted fossils, so it's a religious argument, right? And believing in evolution is sort of counter to having religious beliefs or a connection to God or whatever. So that sort of tends to be the argument. But with climate change, it's different. And what are the arguments about why climate change is evil? What are those arguments? Why do people not like the idea of climate change? It's going to ruin the economy. Is that what you were going to say? There is that as well. So, what was brought up was a religious argument is that only God has the ability to change the earth, and sometimes people actually argue that like it's sort of arrogant of us to assume that we could have such a large impact on Earth and stuff like that. So that's another good point. But it tends to be very anti-big government. So accusations of the UN coming in and forcing sort of these laws on different countries to try to control carbon emissions. There's concern about economic implications. And I'm going to talk more about that later because a lot of the folks who are generating the denial information that's going into classrooms, they tend to be economic think tanks. And so it tends to be economists writing about why the science is bad, not scientists. So that's also an interesting additional point. Sure. So back to the evolution is that the idea that the scientists don't believe in God, and so therefore it's somehow evil what they're coming up with. Yes. So that goes into, so the comment over here was there's folks who believe climate change is happening, but it's not man-made. Yeah, so that goes into, again, the science is wrong. And these definitely interplay with each other because if the science is wrong, then why are we doing all these big government economic remediation type things? Did you have a?
Talking about but not doing.
Sorry?
Talking about but not doing.
Right. Yeah, talking but not doing. Did you have?
Armageddon's coming anyway.
Oh, this is part of Armageddon, sure. Well, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So how the media has been talking about climate change has been a problem, certainly for a long time, because a good media story tends to try to have some sort of debate or argument or something like that. And that's a great way to do it is you interview a scientist and then you interview somebody from an economic think tank, but they're not talking about the same thing then, right? Because of the things I just talked about, these different pillars. Do you want to add one thing and then I'll move on? This is another huge denial argument, and this goes back to the science is wrong, right? So what was brought up was that scientists are somehow in disagreement about this, and there's a big controversy going on within the scientific community, which is inaccurate, but it is heavily pushed forward as a reality. So then the last pillar that we talked about, so we had the 1, 2, and the third one, is demanding equal time. So if the science is bad and potentially evil in some fashion, then we need to just open it up for critical thinking or to let students argue it out. And so with evolution, what would that look like if you were a science teacher and you wanted students to be able to debate evolution? What would you do?
Give them Genesis.
You'd give them Genesis, you could, yeah.
Stage debate,
You could stage debates, that's really very popular.
guest speakers.
You could have guest speakers on both sides of the issue. Yep, go ahead. And I'm so glad you brought that up. So what was brought up was this, instead of saying creationism, which you're not supposed to do anymore, so it's moved on to intelligent design, and this is where the new challenge is coming up in terms of evolution, is teachers or parents or communities, school boards. I don't want to be harshing on teachers because many are doing an excellent job. But what ends up happening is there's a push to have students learn evolution and then counter it with intelligent design and then letting them decide, which fundamentally undercuts the science. So if that's what it looks like for evolution, what does that look like for climate change? Demanding equal time in a classroom. What would you do as a teacher? Quit. You could quit. Let's pretend that you're a well-meaning teacher. You're unsure about whether or not climate change is real. You've heard in the media there's a debate on it. But you want your students to learn about this concept, and it's an opportunity to learn about how to engage in politics. How to use science to engage in politics. So what's that? So you let them do the research?
Where they can get information and make a decision based on that information.
So that's the most common way, is they either let students, they stand up in front of the students and say, well, I don't know what it is, so why don't you guys go out and look at blogs or whatever is available, and you decide for yourself, and then come back to the classroom and debate it out, which again is fundamentally undermines the science and the value of what the scientific community is bringing to the classroom. And so letting the students decide, critical thinking, teaching them under the guise of teaching them both sides, as opposed to other forms of critical thinking, which is like problem solving and those aspects, and focusing a lot on strengths and weaknesses. So, which goes back to evolution, which should sound familiar to folks who've heard about challenges to evolution. Strengths and weaknesses is a popular term. So we've seen these really parallel issues in relation to science denial between evolution and climate change, which is why NCSE decided to start supporting communities to teach good science related to climate change, because the parallels were just very clear and very natural for us to move into that area. One thing, though, that is part of climate change that is not part of evolution, which I find really interesting, is disillusionment, which is very popular and is actually really popular in the science denial classroom material, the lesson plans and stuff like that, which is, well, there's nothing we can do about it anyway. We're all doomed. We're all going to die. So, oh well. So that is a great inspirational message to be bringing to your 15-year-old students. But that, again, is another popular one. So that's a major problem. So hold on one second. I just want to respond to that. So what was brought up was that instead of even teaching the debate, in quotes, what ends up happening is that nothing is taught. And so it's true that weather and climate are addressed in most, if not all, science standards. But if it is addressed in the classroom, it tends to be like, let's talk about the climate over long periods of time. Let's avoid talking about human impacts on the climate. So that's a really good point, is that sometimes when human-caused climate change is brought up, or when climate is taught, the human component of it is left out altogether. So this is part of teaching good citizenship, right? Is you're teaching, is really being a good advocate for so you can know where information is coming from and whether or not it's going to come from a really good source or one that has some sort of financial or political bias.
Doesn't that fit in with scientific research?
Yep, so that's definitely something. Yeah, scientific research. Yep. Yeah, exactly. So always thinking about that component of it is an important point of thinking about, whatever it is you're reading, whether it's scientific or not. Absolutely.
Exploration is very conducive to that age.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, high school students are a good group to try to get enthusiastic about these kind of ideas of like, okay, here's the information you're being given. What are the sources and that sort of thing? And that is a good way to address it. So moving forward in terms of climate change being taught in classrooms, so there are these things called academic freedom acts that have come out in recent years. Has anyone heard of them? Yeah. Have you heard of them because of NCSC or just didn't? Yeah, okay. Because this is our new major concern. So the first one that came out was in 2004, and this was in Alabama, and it was a House bill. And it was the first of attempts to sort of cleverly utilize the term critical thinking to bring other ideas into the science classrooms. So I brought it with me, and I'll just read you a part of it so that you guys can get an idea about what this is about. So the purpose of education includes to teach and fully inform students about the various subjects presented to them at every educational level. Sure. And to fully and completely present to students all information on a given subject so that students may be not only fully informed, but also taught to seek and acquire all information necessary to critical thinking. This sounds pretty good. I'm a fan. I'm a fan of critical thinking.
You're getting all information.
Yeah, all the information. I'm hoping you guys are being sarcastic. Mostly. Yeah, I think your little red flags are just popping up right here. So it goes on, and it's critical thinking will not only lead to new discoveries, scientific and societal progress, medical, environmental, and other advances, but is also necessary to preserve democratic society. Whew, yes. Okay. I'm getting a little like, okay. In order for students to be fully educated and develop the capacity for such critical thinking, it is necessary that teachers and instructors at every level of education be given the affirmative right to present scientific, historical, theoretical, and evidentiary information to students without fear of penalty. Okay. Then we get to Section 6. There's been an extensive amount of debate on the subject of origins, the origins of life and matter, including, among other issues, the questions of how the universe came into existence, when did life begin, and from where did man become. Further, while there are predominant resources that address these questions with the position of evolution, there are many other resources that provide alternative positions. What are the alternative positions? Religious interpretation. Yeah. So suddenly we've moved from critical thinking, which everybody loves, academic freedom. Yes, that's great. And suddenly in science classrooms, alternative positions to evolution. So, and then the bill goes on to say, blah, 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 blah. This is constitutional requirements. The legislature further recognizes that some of the points of view, evidence, and theories on the subject of origins may reflect reference to some religious, theological, or philosophical belief. No kidding. That's surprising. But it is not the purpose of legislature to promote any religious perspective. Yeah, totally not. So red flags are sort of going up everywhere because this is very concerning the way that this is phrased. Go ahead.
That's one of the things Alec came up with, is
No, this is not ALEC. Yeah, and we can talk about that a little bit later. Yeah, so we can talk a little bit about that, but it's interesting because I get that question a lot. So, yeah, because it's legislative. But I'll get to that. So this bill died, and it passed the House, and it died in the Senate. It was not voted on. So this was in 2004, and we wiped our hands and said, well, that was easy. It's over now. And since that time, there's been several other bills. February 12th, there was an Alabama bill. The 17th, the next year, there were 2 Alabama bills. Oklahoma, Alabama again, New Mexico, Missouri, Florida, Louisiana in 2008. Louisiana passed. But what does the Louisiana bill look like? It's a little bit different. It has a lot of the same material, but I'm just going to redo this one part that's a little bit different. The teaching of some scientific subjects, such as biological evolution, sounds familiar, chemical origins of life, familiar, global warming, and human cloning, it's weird, can cause controversy, okay? And that some teachers may be unsure of the expectations concerning how they should present information on such subjects. I'm sure with human cloning, I would be sort of wondering how to teach that to my biology class as well. Don't know where it comes up. Yeah. So we've already talked about what the political and social controversies associated with global warming are. What are the scientific controversies that they're talking about? Yeah. Okay. And since they brought up human cloning, what are the political and social controversies associated with human cloning? Just cloning narrows the gene pool, sure.
It's playing God.
It's playing God. Sort of, some people perceive it to be immoral and evil. That's fine. It's political, sorry? Fetal experimentation. It could create a monster of some sort. I don't know. What are the scientific controversies surrounding human cloning? Is there a scientific controversy about the best way to clone a human that students are taught about in their high school biology class?
Yeah.
That'd be an awesome biology class. I want to take that one. In South Korea? Okay. I'm going to sign up for that one. Medical ethics, right. So this is sort of a medical ethics class. So again, social political controversy, but not necessarily the scientific, like the best way to do it. So those of you who have perhaps children in your lives, I'm assuming when they've taken biology, they've come home and told you how excited they were about their human cloning lab, right? They didn't, okay? All right, so that one in particular was just a little bit weird. Just as a final note, they still included this section. This section only protects the teaching of scientific information, and this section shall not be construed to promoting any religious doctrine, and so on. So the question came up, is this, well, you know what? I'll hold on to that question in a little bit. So
what's the intended purpose of the legislation? I mean, it's all kind of talked around, but what are they actually trying to accomplish by passing this?
what do you think?
Trying to sneak the Bible in.
So the question was what's the purpose of this legislation? And it sounds like we had an answer in the back. Could you repeat it?
To protect teachers who are teaching religion.
It's to protect teachers who are teaching religion in science classrooms. It's to protect teachers who are teaching things that are not being generated from the scientific community and are coming from other sources that perhaps have political or ideological purposes. And so it's in essence muddling the science that students are teaching, and it's protecting. And again, it isn't necessarily about evil teachers. Sometimes the pressure is coming from parents, sometimes it's coming from students, sometimes it's coming from principals and administrators, and a teacher is sort of in a difficult situation. So I think that's important to keep in mind, that I don't want to be attacking teachers even though we sort of hold them dear and responsible. So that was in 2008. And of course, it was all over. Oh, sorry, go ahead. So this is a big thing that we talk about at NCSE, and I'm glad you brought it up, is that oftentimes teachers, when they're sort of put in this difficult situation, they're able to say, well, I'm doing what the standards are telling me to do. You know, and they can keep teaching evolution, or they can keep teaching components of human causes of climate change as it fits with the state standards. And some states have better standards than others. But when you bring in this legislation that undermines the standards, then suddenly they're in a position where they can be given pressure from outside sources. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That's a good point. So of course, that was, okay, we're done. Yay, okay, you guys got it through, good for you. But fortunately, you know, you're not gonna hit any other states, right? Like, whew, we're done. But of course, that was not the case. After Louisiana, there was an attempt in Missouri, Louisiana, Alabama, Michigan, South Carolina, Chicago, Oklahoma, Alabama, Iowa, New Mexico, Missouri, Texas, South Carolina, and my thing is moving too fast for me to follow, so I'll just stop with Tennessee. Tennessee was last year. So, or 2011. So, Tennessee, House Bill 368. This should sound really familiar to you. The teaching of some scientific subjects, including but not limited to biological evolution, chemical origins of life, global warming, and human cloning can cause controversy. How'd they come up with this all on their own? It's amazing. Some teachers may be unsure of the expectations concerning how they should present information on these subjects. That one passed as well. Since then, there have been attempts in Florida, Texas, Indiana, Oklahoma, and Missouri. And this year, we saw Montana, Missouri again, Colorado, Oklahoma, and Indiana and Arizona. So some little success, and takes you a long way, right? Because all of these attempts. Fortunately, most of the bills from this year are now dead. We very strongly encouraged our science groups that we work with, either professional organizations or grassroots organizations in each of these communities, to really make sure that they were contacting the appropriate people to make sure that this legislation didn't pass. The Colorado one, in particular, was concerning because in previous bills, the focus has been evolution and other inclusion of global warming and stem cells and human cloning and sort of these other components that get pushed into these bills appear to be an attempt to either broaden the tent or make it seem like this isn't an evolution-focused bill. But the Colorado one, the woman who actually brought this bill up, said that actually she wanted the focus to be global warming. And so this was the first time where it was actually an attack on the teaching of the science behind climate change, which was a little hard for me to see that. So the question came up, and now I'll come back to it, about whether these bills are being generated from ALEC. So the American Legislative Executive Council, thank you. Exchange Council, thank you. So American Legislative Exchange Council. Has everyone heard sort of those rumors before, or that sort of thing? They like, so what they do is they write a lot of legislation. They're an economic think tank. What's interesting about these bills is they're not being generated from ALEC, and there was some misinformation that was perpetuated on the internet that these bills came from ALEC. But their history as starting with evolution and being the focus being evolution in the beginning doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense for ALEC because they're really concerned about conservative economic policy. So why would they care about evolution? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Where these bills seem to be generated from and being promoted from now are the Discovery Institute. Have you guys heard of the Discovery Institute? Does anybody not know them? Okay. There you go. Apparently you guys know a lot more. Yeah.
Washington, D.C.?
No, Seattle.
Seattle.
What's the Discovery Institute?
Can somebody explain what the Discovery Institute is? Do it.
I'll try.
I don't know. I don't know about their history, if they were in California or not. Yeah, so just for those of you who may not have been able to hear so well, that was a really great summary. Yeah, they're an organization that initially was promoting creationism and then now has sort of moved on to intelligent design. And they actually had one of their lawyers show up to one of the legislative sessions to argue in defense of the bill. So they've pretty much put their stamp on this legislation in terms of their feeling that this is what they want and pushing it forward.
Pardon me, has this cloud of legislation been going on for the last century, or is it a very recent phenomenon?
So the question is this cloud of legislation have a long history or not? And the academic freedom bills in particular, this form, which is the newest, most popular form, seem to have started in 2004 with Alabama. So attempts in the past have been more directed towards trying to bring in creationism, and when that didn't work, this is sort of a clever new way that's a lot sneakier, and it's a lot more successful, unfortunately. Yeah.
So it's recent.
It's recent, yeah, for the past 10 or so years. Yeah. So the question was, why? I guess essentially your question is, why are they including these other issues? Yeah. Who's using who? Whom? Who's using whom? Thank you. Why is this legislation now including global warming and stem cells and so on? Why isn't it focused entirely on evolution? And I don't know specifically. I could guess. You can widen your tent that way because more people are going to hate evolution and climate change and stem cells and human cloning and whatever else you want to add in there. They're going to hate gas mileage. That could be a component of it. And they're going to, so it's a very clever way to widen your tent. And it's a very clever way to avoid accusations of some sort of religious component to it, right? Because, oh, no, it's not religion against evolution. It's just critical thinking against all of these ideas that are controversial quote unquote controversial in the sciences. So they're getting more, they're adapting. Go ahead.
Comment on the Heartland Institute and that sort of thing.
Yeah, the Heartland Institute is sort of has anyone heard of the Heartland Institute? Yeah, they're sort of an organization, they're an organization that, again, is more of an economic think tank in terms of their position on climate change. They promote science denial in relation to human causes of climate change. They actually, I'm reading one of their books right now, and it's giving me such a migraine. They put out curriculum information, like educational information for teachers. They just printed this book about how climate change isn't caused by people that has a very cute little bunch of polar bears on the front riding around in a convertible. It's very funny. That they sent to, it appears that they've sent it to every environmental science professor in the country. That's the feedback that we're getting. So that could be upwards of 10,000 people. So the cost of that many books being sent for free, they're very well funded, very well funded. And we're the only organization that is sort of doing the opposite of that. And so it's a constant upward battle against the kind of misinformation that they're promoting. So I have plenty of negative things to say about them, but I'll stop there. Okay. So if you're going to teach both sides using these new academic freedom acts that are now at your disposal, what would you do? And we kind of talked about that before. And so I'll tell you about what the most popular way to do it is. And again, this is oftentimes being done by teachers who don't know that there's a scientific consensus on climate change. So They tend to be really well-meaning, and I've met a lot of them, and they're very nice, very good people, and very good teachers. So again, this is not to be harshing on teachers at all, but this is sort of a reality of what system we're working in right now. So really popular way is you show an inconvenient truth, and then you show another video or have your students read a book or something like that about how climate change isn't real. And if you want to do that, you have any number of opportunities. There's Understanding Climate Change by the Fraser Institute, which is an economic think tank up in Canada. There's the Energy, Economics, and the Environment, which was put out by an economic group in Indiana. There's Unstoppable Solar Cycles and the Great Global Warming Swindle. So there's a lot of opportunities. And then there's this new book by the Heartland Institute with the polar bears in the convertible driving on the front. So, okay, so there's some curriculum out there. What does it look like? How bad is it? So as an example, I have one for you, and this is Understanding Climate Change from the Fraser Institute. And so their argument was that climate change is not caused by people. It's caused by solar cycles, maybe. And our proof of that is that Earth is not the only planet where temperatures are increasing. Didn't know that. Mars, which is not affected by carbon dioxide emissions caused by human activity, has been warming as well. I didn't know. You know, I'm a biologist. I don't study Mars. That's interesting. They had a citation. This I like. I love looking at citations. The citation was from NASA. Wow, this must be like real. So I looked it up. Unfortunately, the internet is a wealth of information. So I went back and I looked, and there was an article there, and it was written by NASA, and it was about gullies that they found in sand dunes on Mars, which was unrelated at all to warming or anything related. Climate change, carbon dioxide. I think they mentioned carbon dioxide gas sometimes rises from the sand dunes. It was, yeah, so it was totally wrong. And actually, you can't see the picture here now, but I'll show you later if you come up. They had pictures of the gullies that they found. So it wasn't even like I was misreading the article. It was like, look, these are the gullies. And it's really exciting because we're super nerds and we love that kind of stuff. But totally unrelated to climate change. So has anyone ever heard this argument before that Mars is warming? Never heard it?
Mars is what?
Warming? Warming. That's true. Some people don't believe we've been to Mars. Well, that we have a little robot there. Some people don't believe we've been to the moon. Mars is my favorite climate denial argument. It's because it's so out there, literally out there. But anytime I have a question about where did this come from, like this just seems so ludicrous, I go to my favorite website, which is skepticalscience.com. Has anyone been there before? Yeah, it's awesome. It's awesome. So basically, it's a bunch of researchers who have this beautiful website where they go through every single oh, everyone's writing it down. I wish I had a chalkboard for you. But yeah, skepticalscience.com. They go through every climate denial argument, and they break it down into easy, like ski slopes, so green for easy, blue for intermediate, and I think they sometimes have a black diamond, not always. And they cite the research, they explain it really well, and they explain what we know and what we don't know, because this is science and the science is still accumulating, so there are still questions to be asked, always. But I looked it up on global warming on Mars, and it was right there, and it's a very popular climate change denial argument. And I'm not going to tell you why that argument is wrong, because you should go look it up on their website. But they do a really nice job. So you can't see the little picture here, but basically I went through this entire curriculum, and I used little pink Post-it notes to point out all the scientific errors. And misuse of information, data mining, those types of things. And I ran out of pink Post-it notes. So I had to move to blue. And actually, this newest book that I'm reviewing, I actually, after the first page, I was like, I can't use Post-it notes because there's so many errors in this. But how many school teachers, well-meaning or not, have time to do that, to look through all the citations, to have the information available to them? They don't. They hardly have time enough for their classroom itself. So that's the real problem. And the goal of providing this information, again, is to create doubt. Because it doesn't matter whether or not you completely don't think climate change doesn't exist. It's just enough if there's a question in your mind about it, because you're less likely to want to do anything about it, which ultimately is the major concern of all of these curriculum, is they tend to always end with an economic argument. So you've sort of been led down this road about the bad science, bad science, bad science. Last chapter, economics. Yeah, so some of what we do is we review all the curriculum and we make our reviews available online. And so I've been sort of on a spree of reviewing curriculum. It's really, actually, it's kind of hard for me to do because it's so depressing. I have to balance it with other things. And with this most recent curriculum, or this most recent book that just went out to all these science teachers, there was some discussion, do we need to send out a press release or some really detailed information about why all of these things that they're saying is wrong? And there was concern about giving it more press than it deserves, because the majority of university science teachers understand the science behind climate change and will take something like that and throw it in the trash or put it out as something to laugh at, which is very fortunate. The problem, though, is if those books end up with high school teachers, because they might not be as familiar with the science, which again is not their fault at all, but it's not necessarily something that is written into the science education curriculum for science teachers. So what was brought up was the dissemination of this, possibly by preachers, sure, if there are preachers who feel very strongly, also by economic groups as well, if they feel very strongly about this. So the dissemination tends to be really deep, and it's certainly very troubling. Will this curriculum influence testing and that sort of thing? And I don't think that that's our major concern. Fortunately, science standards tend to be pretty good. Right now, what we have coming up in California is the next generation science standards. Has anyone heard of this? It's nationwide. It's not national, so it's actually generated by 26 lead states, and California was one of them. So go California, yeah, may it be a lead state.
Who's doing this?
So it's being generated by the states themselves, and so then it's up to them whether or not they choose to implement them. I think California is looking like it would be promising for it to pick up the next generation science standards. So what they include is they actually include climate, and they include human components and effects on climate, as well as impacts and risks and that sort of thing. So it does a nice job of raising the bar for several of the states, which either didn't have standards already on human causes of climate change, or ones that had a little bit funky components. So for example, West Virginia and Rhode Island both had in their science standards encouraging students to argue the economic implications of climate change versus the environment. So it was sort of like in a science classroom, which is not an appropriate way to teach the science. So in those states, it's going to be a huge leg up. And so to finish on your question, the tests tend to be more oriented to the standards. So if the standards are good, the tests hopefully will also be good. And for those teachers who are teaching for the tests, that could be a good thing then, because it'll make sure that they'll have that. That's not to say that teaching to the test is a good thing, because it leaves out all these other parts of teaching. So the states did. The states set the standards. Yeah. So this was, but in collaboration with each other. So the question is, where are these bills being generated from? So these were House and Senate bills. So it tends to be more on a state level. But that's not to say that things don't happen on a school board level and so on. So interestingly, after the Louisiana bill passed, this past year, the city of New Orleans put out a little piece saying that, yes, we understand this legislation passed, but we're going to teach the consensus on these different issues. And it was great for the scientific community, and several scientific organizations that had said, we're not going to go to New Orleans because of this, changed their mind. So, and they made it very clear when the bill was passed that we will no longer go to your state because of the way that you're treating science. And then they decided, well, we'll go to New Orleans. Sure. So the question is, if the state says one thing and the city says something else, what happens? I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is, in this case, it hasn't come up yet. But it'll be interesting if it does, you know, so who's going to have, and it could be really interesting, you know, politically. So just stay tuned.
For the most part, they'll take it down.
So it's the difference, yeah, so it's the difference of, if a teacher has a really good principal who says you need to have the science taught as is coming from the scientific community and as is the consensus, then the teacher can just do that. Although teachers can go rogue, and whatever happens when you close the door, you don't know. Yeah, you don't know. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you know, testing is an area I know less about, so I'm not certain I can comment on exactly how these things trickle down into testing. I think yeah. One last question, and then I'll move on with my talk. Yeah, you know, that's a good question, is about training. You know, so why aren't teachers getting the training and so on? And it really depends on where you get your training. And in the case of climate change, it's most often taught in the earth sciences, though sometimes in the life sciences, in terms of how it will impact biological organisms and that sort of thing. Some earth sciences teachers have been trained in other fields and then will teach, you know, chemistry and earth sciences, or biology and earth sciences, in which case you won't necessarily have that training. So the question is, shouldn't they have an inclination towards science? I'm 100% on board with you that yes, and fundamental training in the sciences should include, you know, how do you get your information and fundamental aspects of science. In addition, you know, climate change, the science of climate change in terms of it being incorporated into education is still pretty new, even though the science behind it isn't necessarily new. So if you were trained, you know, 20 years ago, you might not have had that information, even though there's professional development and there's opportunities to learn it now, but there's opportunities to learn lots of things now. And yes, I appreciate the comment that maybe I'm being a little too easy on science teachers, but I want to make sure that, you know, we're sort of in this together and we all want the same thing, right? Oh yes, so the textbook industry is huge and needs to be watched, and I completely agree. And part of our reviewing of curriculum has involved reviewing textbooks by you know, the big textbook companies, and Texas is a big part of what gets through and what doesn't. And so far, I haven't been incredibly impressed, which is disappointing. But I guess the reverse side of that is that a lot of teachers are moving away from textbooks, even though they might be available to them. Most of them, or not most, but many are moving more towards internet resources, which is good because there's a lot of really great curriculum that's very time sensitive and you can just push it out and make it available to teachers. But it's bad because there's so much bad stuff on the internet. And if you type in climate change curriculum, you could end up with anything. And it could be good or it could be bad. And so that's problematic. Okay, so how can you have critical thinking in science courses? What could that look like? Instead of having students debate the science, which is inaccurate, what would you do as a teacher? What could you do? So you talked about sort of almost the evolution of evolution, like how it is that we know what we know. So the building of evidence. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that tends to be the sort of thing that when people teach climate change well, that's what they do. So it tends to be very evidence-based. It's based on evidence that's derived from the scientific community and from science from published papers that's been interpreted into material that's accessible to students. And it encourages them to investigate the same questions that researchers are asking, rather than asking them to debate questions that researchers aren't. So it's more in line with what's actually happening in the scientific community, which is great training for adulthood. So what are those questions that scientists are wondering? Do you guys know? You have any thoughts? That you could have a student ask. Feedback loops, yep, which actually is part of the Earth Sciences standards. How carbon dioxide affects climate, which could be under Earth Sciences or under chemistry as well. How melting of glaciers, yep. So a combination of the evidence demonstrating the melting of glaciers and also how glaciers impact climate and making predictions based on that. So then again, from an Earth Sciences class. Can anyone think of something I could, if I was a life sciences teacher, so biology, what could I, for critical thinking, what questions should I be asking my students to ask? You could ask questions about adaptation to climate.
I'm a Canadian, and Canada just loves climate change.
Oh, as a
They're way up north, and everything. So someone should kick the ass of Canada.
Okay, so yeah, well, that's more of a social studies question about how, or a political science question even, how are studies responding? Sure, in the back. Yeah, so arguments, so that's actually an interesting point. So talking to students about deep time and going way back into time and how climate has changed and then comparing it to now and how is it different now? I heard oh, no? Okay, one more, and then I'll give my suggestions. So looking at catastrophic events, do you mind if or one more and then you go on? Yeah. Well, I guess I was asking what are the good critical thinking questions students should be asking. So one example that actually we chatted with some climate scientists and we were like, what do you think? And these were their suggestions. How much is sea level going to rise by the year 2100? So we know it's going to, but is it going to be this much? Is it going to be this much? And certainly those are the questions that can be answered in an earth science class and also in chemistry because there's a component of water expanding as well. Yeah, so an interesting connection between human impacts on climate change and then also impacts of climate change on humans, right? So both pieces of that. So there's also this component of cooling from aerosols offsetting greenhouse gases, which is what climate scientists think a lot about, like how do these different pieces of gases and all the different things in the atmosphere fit together. And that also goes into earth sciences class. They have to learn about aerosols and different components of the climate. And then as a life scientist, I get more excited about these kinds of questions that are asked I'm trying to think of the right word, a lot, in the biological sciences, which is how will warming influence different components of timing of life cycle events, like when things flower? How will it impact crops? How will it impact animals? All of these things directly relate to the life sciences and also tend to be covered by the standards. So these are good questions to be asking because it might depend on what kind of crop or what kind of animal or where you are because of water accessibility and that sort of thing. So these are interesting critical thinking questions that can be asked without sort of falling into debate, you know. So, and also it helps with problem solving. So the question, of course, that everyone has at the end of my talk is, what can I do about it? And I think I brought it up a couple times, but emphasizing that we're all sort of in this together in terms of making sure that science teachers are teaching good science and have the support and the information that they need in order to do it. And so no one's the enemy necessarily, but just that we want to make sure that that students are getting good education, because they're going to need this information when they're adults. There's no question about it. Ensuring that quality science is happening, science education is happening in your school. I don't have any doubt that if you're living in the Bay Area, that's the case. So I'm not very worried about that. Supporting the implementation of really good science standards, like the next generation science standards, they're looking pretty good, and they're coming to California, and we're definitely thinking that they're going to actually generate a lot of really good educational material. And then spread the word to make sure students are learning the science. And if you're not already a member of NCSE, you should consider joining. But it looks like there's quite a few members here, and help support our efforts as well. So now I can open it up for more questions. Yeah.
So where does the NCSE get their funding?
Oh.
Where do you get your funding?
So we're a membership organization. So a large chunk of our funding comes directly from members. And it's actually very cool, because around the holidays, we get these big stacks of like $10, $20 checks, which is really fun to see that, as a grassroots organization, we have a lot of support from our members, which is great. So this is a big argument that people have, like, education is too slow. We need to do just communication, communication, communication. And we've tried to educate people for so long, and they're still not getting it. And so that's something I hear a lot from folks who are emphasized that are more from the communication on climate change. And I think that there's a couple things about that. First of all, yes, communication now is really important, and we need to keep doing that, but we're just going to keep perpetuating the same problem over and over and over again if people don't have the scientific information, first of all. Second of all, I went to a public school in America, as I'm sure many of you did, so I'm a strong advocate for really good, strong science education in public schools. And so there's nothing that drives me more bonkers is like wasting kids' time in the science classroom. Yeah. I forgot you wanted to say some things before I started questioning, but are you good, Larry? Okay, good. Okay, I'll go back. Any other? Sure. So I think that's a really relevant comment. So what basically it comes down to two parts, right? What's happening in private schools, because they're going to be different than what's happening in public schools. And the second part of that is what's happening within the religious community and their perspective on both evolution and climate change. And it's one of those things where in both cases it depends. So some religions are fine with evolution. So Catholicism, the Pope's okay with evolution. Well, that's maybe. And then there are religions that are not okay with evolution and don't want to teach it. And then the same thing goes for climate change too. So there are evangelical groups who feel very strongly that God gave the planet to people, and it's up to people to preserve the planet, very based on sort of this Genesis idea of people tending the earth. And then there are other folks who have an equally sort of anti-climate change perspective based on their perspective on religion as well. So it depends, Private schools are interesting because in some cases they have a lot of flexibility. And so you might have a really great and limited accountability. Yeah, your accountability is to the payer. So that is tricky. So the question is, does NCSE get involved with school vouchers? And we don't actually. We don't take a position on it. And part of the reason why is because we have our hands full already with just addressing quality science education. But maybe someday we'll be able to expand to other areas of education and take positions on different political issues as well. But right now, we're very focused on just ensuring that that quality education is happening. So the question is, if a teacher is mandated to teach the controversy on climate change, are they allowed to say in the beginning of class, like, I've been mandated to do this? There isn't currently a mandate to teach the controversy, and so that's why this policy is very slippery, right? It's if they want to, because this might be confusing because you're floating in space and have no background whatsoever in science or something. And so as far as I know, it just hasn't come up. Well, I think, so the question is, where can you find the papers on sort of the consensus, right? And that's and who writes them? So one, pretty well-known one talking about climate change are the IPCC reports, which are available online. And if you have about 1,000 pages of paper you want to print out, you can print them all out. And they tend to do a nice job of making it available. It's United Nations, so therefore it's inherently evil, and they're trying to control us. If you're has anyone heard about the National Climate Assessment? This is very exciting. So the National Climate Assessment is coming out. The draft just came out, and it just went through review. And this is sort of like the IPCC report, but it's just for the U.S. and it's region specific. So they actually have a California component of it. In which they talk about impacts on different aspects of climate change on the U.S. And it's a really interesting, cool read. And I think the final draft is going to come out after the review process. So it must be a couple months from now because they just closed for review. But it'll be another component of sort of what does the literature say, and in language that is easier to follow. Yeah, so you don't have to necessarily have a background. Oh, this is from, let's see if I can get the acronym right, the US GCRP, which is coming from the federal government. Yeah, so this is something, so this is the federal government trying to con us or something. Yeah, go ahead. So the question is, why is the U.S. so different? Why are we so different? I don't know. I get asked that a lot. I actually think it's really funny to talk to some of my European friends who think that we're incredibly kooky here in the U.S. But I don't know if you guys have that experience too. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, these are the challenges that I think that we have to deal with when addressing climate change, right? There's all these different components of, if we understand the science, then what do we do, and so on. One thing that's really nice that I didn't mention as a way of teaching critical thinking is engaging students in mitigation, adaptation, and thinking about solutions. Because one of the major components of what students are going to have to do in the future is address some problems that we're setting into motion right now, or some challenges and obstacles we're setting into motion right now. And if we don't give them even the basic information on what's happening, why it's happening, and potential solutions, then they're going to be sort of left holding the bag, which is unfortunate. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I mean, that's the nice thing about education. I think you pointed out a couple of things, is that there are these teachable moments that you can't let slip by, and that's why the internet is so great, because you can be like, okay, here's this moment in time where these people are talking about this thing, let's create a curriculum around it and get it out to schools right away, which in the past just wasn't available, right? Or books and so on. Yeah, and then the other component that I like about that story is that there's this concept in sort of the skeptical community, that's the wrong word, in folks that do not believe in climate change, the human impacts of climate change, thank you, that the environment is counter to economic interests. And so, and that tends to be a lot of what is brought into classrooms when climate change is taught. And that is the wrong attitude. That is the wrong way to address climate change science.